what if I told you the central bankers and governments think that Bitcoin is the pristine asset that is going to allow them to print money forever? This is an idea I've been tossing around now for a couple of days, and I can't get it out of my head.
Take a look at this.
Jesus Christ, Charlie.
That right there is the mail. Now let's talk about the mail. Can we talk about the mail, please, Mac? I'm dying to talk about the mail with you all day, okay? Pepe Sylvia. This name keeps coming up over and over again. Every day, Pepe's mail's getting sent back to me. Pepe Sylvia, Pepe Sylvia. I look in the mail. Well, this whole box is Pepe Sylvia.
As a Bitcoin enjoyer, we often find ourselves reading a lot about money creation. And it's not just money creation in our modern times, but obviously the history of money creation, and even the history of the history of debt as well. Something that's very peculiar is some of the oldest Egyptian tablets and even Mesopotamian tablets that were found were actually discovered to be ledgers. And what a monetary ledger is an account of debts. Okay? So when we think back to the origins of money creation, we often have this this idea, which was implanted for us by in most cases, at least in the Western world, in our education system, that the world began with barter, right? And essentially, bartering became impractical as economies grew, and there needed to be a medium of exchange. Now, I've been reading this book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years, and this was recommended on Twitter, or X, whatever you want to call it, by Shinobi or Brian Trolls. And yeah, when it comes to the money creation books, I'm always a fan of this. I read Jekyll Island. Obviously, I read Nick Szabo's article, Shelling Out. So yeah, it's the money creation thing is very interesting. Now, what this book, Debt, puts forward is that our monetary history essentially is a fable. The idea, like I said, that we started off with this barter system and then somehow needed to evolve is actually incorrect. Based on the archaeological finds of these tablets with recordings of debt, it actually seems to point to the fact that we did not start off with barter and that we actually started off with debt. Now, this is a very interesting thing because when we look at our current money system essentially exists because the country or the government that we are under has borrowed from another entity, right? So essentially, our monetary system exists by virtue of this borrowing from another entity. Now, obviously, this poses a bit of a problem, right? Number one, there is a central point of failure, right? There is obviously limited entities that can lend or create debt for countries, right? So obviously this is going to create a concentration of power. So as time has gone on, we've also seen that essentially 99% of the fiat currencies in existence have collapsed. So fiat currencies, money by decree, doesn't last. So there's a very big, there's a money problem, right? That there's this issue where essentially once the trust in the issuing authority runs out or begins to erode, then the money starts to all of a sudden be perceived to have less purchasing power. Okay, and that's just one of the many factors of the loss of that purchasing power. But the main point is the perception and the trust in the issuing authority. Okay, and this is where it gets interesting. So what if we could create a monetary system that has an anchor with no authority, right? And I mean, obviously, the people paying attention to this are like, yeah, Phil, we know about Bitcoin. We're not stupid. No, I get it. Like, I get that, right? But that's not it. That's not it at all. Okay. This is just the beginning of the iceberg. It's the tip of the iceberg. Okay. So the financial alchemists, right? So regardless, I don't care who it is, the San Francisco, the PayPal mafia, this, that, DOD, CIA. I don't care whose names and acronyms and whatever you throw at, it doesn't make a difference. Okay. The people in charge of creating money and the people in charge of infinite debt. Okay. So these financial architects, right? Their power, or according to them, their power could be limitless if there was an anchor, okay? If there was this pristine asset that they could then use to print money against infinitely. Because going back to my point about perception, right? In 1971, Nixon took the U.S. off of the gold standard, and essentially what ended up happening was it created a free floating mark for the dollar, right? The dollar was no longer pegged to this gold, and it could be free, but really it's not about the freedom. It was about the fact that no one had to ask for permission anymore to create more dollars. It didn't matter how much gold was being held in reserve because the money isn't tied to the gold. So now we go back to Bitcoin, okay? We've got this pristine asset that is controlled by no government, that is owned by many, but not by one, okay? And now all of a sudden, we have the organic market that builds around Bitcoin, right? There's a whole bunch of people like me, right? All of us Bitcoiners, right? That come to the space for NGU or medium of exchange, whatever it is. And essentially you have this grassroots movement to this headless money. Now, if you think about it, right? Bitcoin now becomes the anchor. And this has to do with the idea that I explained before, okay? The way that a country has, in our current day and age, the way that a country creates money is by borrowing. Well, what if countries could borrow from the bank of Bitcoin? This is why I think that Bitcoin is the banker's dream, because we're seeing it right now. We're seeing it. A great example is MicroStrategy, right? MicroStrategy, Michael Saylor's been purchasing a whole bunch of Bitcoin. And what is he doing? He's creating debt with it, right? It's the same thing. So governments are obviously going to catch on to this. Now, you have to remember, this is a perception game. It's a shell game, okay? We all know that Bitcoin is the pristine asset. But if your government, whose money is devaluing very quickly and people are losing faith in their dollar, what can the government do to shore that faith up? Well, for one thing, they can make fiscally responsible decisions, such as purchasing Bitcoin or claiming to purchase Bitcoin. And the citizens who are now becoming accustomed to understanding Bitcoin's qualities, all of a sudden they start to cheer for the government. All of a sudden, the government is doing good things. Now, since the perception of the government is changing, then all of a sudden what happens? Well, the government can continue to print, maybe with a little bit less resistance, right? Let's face it, every time the government prints, people go in awe, they get all upset. It's, you know what I mean? We're looking at inflation, we're looking at this, but it's a perception game, right? People don't complain if they perceive that things are going well or that they are getting personally wealthier. So in this particular case, the government, through perception, gets to essentially create this idea that, hey, we are fiscally responsible. We're looking out for the country. We're going to do a Bitcoin strategic reserve, right? And now all of a sudden it's like, well, wait a second. Our money is not losing its purchasing power that quickly because it's backed by Bitcoin. And now what does this allow governments to do? This allows them to print even more money.
I suddenly had this feeling that everything was connected. It's like I could see the whole thing, one long chain of events.
I believe that Bitcoin is this pristine monetary anchor that is going to allow, in the short term, for governments to be able to continue to kick the can down the road. Now, obviously, that kind of sounds bearish, right? It's like, so you mean fiat's not dying? You mean like this isn't going to all change? No, I actually think it is going to change. And what's interesting is that essentially governments will believe that they figured out this method, but really all it does is just kick the can down the road. A great example is this tweet from Tom Honzig, okay? And I think that he hit the nail on the head, and it's just interesting because I feel like we're all I feel like we're all in sync, so to speak. The thing that could make this more complicated is if governments start trying to back their currencies with Bitcoin, which could delay their demise. Outside of that, I firmly believe Saylor is wrong when he suggests that Bitcoin is good for or can coexist with the USD long term. So I believe that this is 100%, right? It's a shell game. It's another mechanism for governments to be able to kick the can down the road. Now, look, it may delay the, in quote, right, the idea of hyper-Bitcoinization. I hate to use the term hyper-Bitcoinization because essentially since the white paper dropped, that's the beginning of hyper-Bitcoinization. You can draw a line in the sand anywhere you want. That's where I've drawn my line in the sand, okay? I believe that all of this is hyper-Bitcoinization. But yes, this is just a shell game for the governments to be able to continue to print their dollars. That's all it is. And make no mistake, at some point, right, the next step that's going to happen is that people are going to realize that the fact that the government holds Bitcoin doesn't actually mean anything for the security and the strength of their dollar or the competence or capability of the government, because in the end that they're just using it for perception. It is only being used in order for us, the peons, to continue to have faith in a centralized entity that will still continue to print money out of nothing. The more I think about it, the clearer it becomes that that's what is happening. And the reason why I thought of this really was because of all of these, to be honest, these shitty companies that have no earnings. Right? That's what got me thinking about this when it came to the government. And then, of course, I tie that in with the book Debt, and it just totally clicked because at one portion in the book, the author David Graeber is explaining that essentially kings would borrow money, and that borrowing action is what would spawn their kingdom's monetary systems. So essentially, without that borrowing mechanism, they were not able to fund everything in their kingdoms. Now, what's interesting about it is that the more I started to think about that, the more I started realizing that borrowing mechanism is the anchor to that financial system, which then got me thinking of Bitcoin. Well, it's like, well, wait a second. If the perception is that Bitcoin is this pristine asset, then that is the most pristine monetary anchor in history, which means governments are going to be able to print even more than they ever have because of this anchor. And what's beautiful about it is that it's not controlled by any centralized entity, and it's hard capped. So right there, you're not having to, you're not going to the IMF, you're not going to the Rothschild Bank, you're not going to any of these central banks. You're not doing any of this, right? You're able to just point to this pristine asset that's not being controlled or coerced by anyone, and you get to say, hey, this is what we're basing our dollars off of. It's a brilliant shell game, and it's going to be able to kick the can down the road a little longer for fiat. But guys, this is not a depressing episode. This is to let you know, like, we're freaking winning. This is winning. Okay, this is what happens. They are actively doing the analogy of the bed of Procrustes, right, where the governments are essentially trying to shoehorn Bitcoin into their system. It's like, well, we can't control it, so how can we use it to do what we do? Right. And in the bed of Procrustes, for the people who don't know this, right, essentially, I don't remember I think it was a king, right? So the king would have guests. And if the guest was too short for the bed, he would stretch the guest out to fit the bed. If the guest was too tall, he would cut the legs and cut the arms off till they fit in the bed. And this is exactly what the governments are doing. Let me know if you think I've gone totally off the deep end. That's all I wanted to talk about. I'll catch you next time.